Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. My journey with these games is a pretty interesting one, so it's always a fun time trying to talk about them. I got both of these games on release back in the summer of 2003. That's when they released in the UK. And I didn't like them at all. They caused me to drop into a lengthy hiatus from mainline Pokémon. But now, I actually really appreciate these games in a lot of ways. A lot of thoughts flying around at the moment. So I think it's time for a considered retrospective. Let's settle in for a good old chat about Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. Mainline Pokémon games up until this point spawned us into our bedroom. Ruby and Sapphire spawns us into the back of a truck, so that's different right off the bat. It was the first inclination of how much quirkier this generation of Pokémon was going to be compared to the ones that came before it. In these games, our character is freshly arrived in the Hoenn region, moving into Little Root Town with our mum. And in these games, we also have a dad in the picture, and he's a gym leader of all things. That was a welcome change, although sadly not one that would carry over into future games, but oh well. And as we hop out of the moving truck and into the house, things start feeling familiar once again. We can get ourselves settled in and have a little mooch around the town, which fits the bill and looks like any other starting town in Pokemon. So naturally, the first thing you're going to want to do is pop over to the lab and get your starter Pokemon, right? Wrong, because the professor isn't there. To be fair, Red and Blue kinda do the same thing. We have to try to leave the town to find the professor, but there is a bit more drama injected into our first meeting in this one, as we see Professor Birch being chased around by a Poochyena, and we're asked to pick a Pokemon from a bag on the ground to battle it and scare it off. And I do love the image of me pondering over this decision for a good 15 minutes, while Professor Birch is just cowering in a corner. In the anime, he's up a tree. That's probably a bit more humorous. And I will say that I've always liked the Hoenn starters. They certainly weren't part of my initial issues with these games. This is a solid trio, I think. Trico is my guy, I always choose him for most playthroughs, and I couldn't resist doing it again here. Once we get our starter, we'll let loose into the big wide world of Hoenn. So let's chat about this region. Hoenn has a very different vibe to it. There's a brightness to this region that the two before it didn't have. Kanto and Johto were very homey, cozy regions for the most part. Hoenn, by comparison, is more like a holiday destination. That's the energy I get from it. It feels sunny and tropical. Sometimes it was like I could feel the humidity of Hoenn coming through my Game Boy screen. That came across a little too poetic. Of course, we pushed onto the Game Boy Advance for the first time here, so there's a lot more colour and detail going on. There are a lot of different looking buildings in the towns and cities rather than the same cut and paste one or two all over the place. I remember it being a lot. It was really overstimulating in a way. For people like me who had sunk God knows how many hundreds of hours into both Kanto and Johto, but the jump from Johto to Hoenn was much bigger than the jump from Kanto to Johto. Hoenn is a region where most of the locations feel so entirely different from each other, which I think is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because each location has its own unique personality and culture, but it's a bad thing because it feels like there's less of a collective Hoenn culture as a result. There aren't a lot of commonalities between the locations. That point doesn't run too deep though, because you could probably say that about a lot of regions. I like Hoenn though. I'm trying to keep my brain on the original Ruby and Sapphire Hoenn here, rather than as it is in the remakes. But I always note that I think Hoenn would make a great open world. If Pokemon is going to continue pushing in that direction, this would be a really good region to do that with in my opinion. I think you could expand and connect all these locations pretty easily. The biggest cliche about Hoenn is the whole too much water thing. The region is kind of half and half, which plays well into the themes of the story in these games, but it still annoyed a lot of people apparently. I think it's just that traveling across water in earlier Pokemon games wasn't the most exciting thing. The water takes up the entire screen, you're surrounded on all sides, it's fairly easy to get lost, and there's a lot of it to cross in Ruby and Sapphire. Again, another thing I think would actually be an advantage in a modern open world style. I think the open seas would be really fun to navigate, and then seeing the next island coming into view, it suits 3D worlds a lot more. But for these games, I think the best solution to the frustrations with all the water is a healthy number of repels and plenty of grass and electric Pokemon on your team. And a Bulbapedia map maybe. Those would have saved me a lot of time as a kid. Hoenn's a cool region. It does genuinely feel like it has a bit of everything you could think of in terms of terrain. Forests, beaches, deserts, volcanoes, big cities, small towns, underwater caverns, and even a town that's purely made up of tree houses. It's still a region based on Japan, but it doesn't feel like it's based all that much on Japan. It's trying to be its own thing, just in the same overall shape as a real Japanese region. Inhabiting this region are 135 new Pokemon. I feel like the expectations were maybe a little bit higher for this generation, because Johto kinda just built on Kanto in terms of the Pokédex. It filled out some evolution lines, some beta Pokemon that didn't make the OG 151 got a rework. But Hoenn, it felt like we needed some really fresh ideas for this one. And, in my opinion, they delivered. I've mentioned that the starter trio is solid. One of those rare trios where I enjoy all 3 stages of all 3 Pokemon. Zigzagoon is fantastic, although it would later be overshadowed by the far superior Galarian variant. Fight me in the comments. I loved the idea of the regional bug line being a split evolution path. As frustrating as it was trying to get a Beautifly and having 4 Wurmple in a row evolving into Cascoon, Poochyena is one of my absolute favourite Pokemon. Fun fact, the first ever emote I had commissioned for my Twitch and Discord was a waving Poochyena. You should totally follow me on Twitch and join the Discord. The Ralts line came from Hoenn. Tropius, Nuzleaf, Manectric, Torkoal. Plusle and Minun are still my favourite Pikachu clones. I think they're so underrated. Are there any Pokemon I really don't like in Hoenn? Claydol. What the hell is that thing? Overall, it's a Pokédex that's aged really well though. Looking through it, there are so many Pokemon in here that continue to get a lot of love and attention to this day, despite the crazy amount of new Pokemon we've had since. It was a tall order for Game Freak. But I'd definitely say there are more hits than misses with this region's roster. So let's dip our toes into the story of Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. Because for all the flack these games caught over the sheer quantity of water, this is the moment where Pokémon started aiming for something a little bigger than the basic beat the gyms, stop the baddies, become the champion formula. That still kind of is the case, but there are much higher stakes in this one. And the villains we find ourselves up against aren't just cartoonish criminals, they're environmental extremists. In Ruby and Sapphire, we lock horns with not one, but 2 antagonist teams, Team Magma and Team Aqua. 2 very similar teams with polar opposite end goals. Team Magma wants to expand the world's landmass, giving more space for humans and Pokemon to build on, and Team Aqua wants to expand the seas, believing the waters to be more important to the overall ecosystem. Now, obviously common sense tells us that both of these ideas are daft. I think even as a kid I felt smarter than these idiots, so they are still cartoonish in a sense. But I think the interesting thing with these 2 teams is that they're definitely more misguided than they are evil. They believe what they're doing is the correct thing, so they almost don't even know that they're the villains in the story. But there's still a deeper narrative in here than we got in the 2 generations before this. The members of both these teams feel more like full-on characters instead of faceless henchmen. The leaders, Maxie and Archie, are entertaining to say the least. And it all leads up to an exciting climax that integrates the box legendaries of these games. I think it is still a bit surface level as a story arc. There's not much emotion in it for me. And that's something I think Pokemon does really well when it wants to lean in that direction. It's like a middle ground. There's more depth to the characters, but a little less depth to the overall tension and conflict. In a region like this though, I think something a bit more flashy and flamboyant is kinda fitting. But the drama is definitely there, and that's the main thing for the Hoenn region in my opinion. The rival situation is a bit flat in these games. For starters, our rival is just the opposite gender character to us, so whether it's Brendan or May, the character is just the same. But Ruby and Sapphire did mark the end of a very short 2-generation run of purely bitter, antagonistic rivals. When people say they miss the old-style rivals in Pokemon, they're talking about these 2, Blue and Silver, and that's pretty much it. From Ruby and Sapphire, Pokemon rivals shift into becoming friendlier. More like companions you have a bit of healthy competition with. And as the generations have gone on, we have started getting the odd additional rival that is a bit more spiteful in personality. But that hasn't happened yet in these games. And it's one of the reasons I didn't like Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire at first. I always really enjoyed the tension between me and Blue and me and Silver. I feel like those rivals pushed me to be better, because they were so annoying and dislikable that when I came up against them, I didn't just want to beat them, I wanted to thrash them. It was a full-on grudge match. In Hoenn, they're just too passive, a bit too pleasant. They don't really push you in any meaningful way. And sure, having a change of pace like that can have its own charm, and I see what they're going for. It's more of a rival you grow alongside. We're learning and navigating this world together. I think later generations have struck a better balance. It just leaned a little too hard in the opposite direction in Ruby and Sapphire for me. Interesting topic of discussion for sure though, so absolutely do drop any thoughts you have on it down in the comments. The gyms are as great as ever though. It feels like there was a vague attempt at nostalgia with how the gyms play out in Ruby and Sapphire. We start with a rock gym, same as in Red and Blue. Then we cross the ocean to battle a fighting gym. We also did that in Gold and Silver. Watson's gym definitely has notes of Vermilion City with its switches puzzle. They're new but familiar to start off with. Then things get a bit more spicy with Flannery's gym in Lava Ridge. And then facing off against your own father for a gym badge. That had some real weight to it the first couple of times around. Winona's gym is really satisfying to solve. We have our first double gym leader battle with Tate and Liza. And the final gym is perhaps the one people got stuck on the most. But oh my god, is it a rush when you finally figure it out. So yeah, I think Hoenn's gyms deserve a lot of praise. They're fun and varied, and you definitely feel the atmosphere in each one. After all that, you're on to the Elite Four. And I'm gonna be honest, this is one of those less memorable Elite Fours for me in the mainline series. Drake's fairly memorable, but I'm not overly bowled over by this region's Elite Four. To be honest though, I feel like I'm like that with most Elite Fours. I think it's because particularly in these earlier generations, you don't see anything of the Elite Four trainers until you're facing off against them. They just sort of pop in out of nowhere considering their importance to the region. Even in Johto, my favourite generation, I'm kind of about the Elite Four. And I suppose the Pokemon League isn't the big finale that it once was. Like, the whole story with Team Magma and Aqua was absolutely the centerpiece of Ruby and Sapphire. And then this is just that final test of strength to formalize yourself as the greatest trainer in the region. The champion, Steven Stone, is a more involved and charismatic character. I do like him as a final challenge. It's almost an eerie final battle. The build up to it feels quite muted, almost like it's not a big deal, but then the battle itself is really difficult. And then there's a quiet satisfaction in winning and taking that champion crown as the credits roll in. So with all the game's content out of the way, let's chat for a quick minute about the mechanics of Ruby and Sapphire, because that's where a lot of my initial grievances with these games came from. Emphasis on initial grievances. I've changed my mind on a lot, if not all of these things now. It'd be weird if I didn't, because these games were basically the foundation for a lot of modern Pokemon. Abilities came in these games, which it's kind of wild to think about Pokemon without those now. I remember they were a lot to adjust to at the time, and my brain kinda rejected them at first, but they added so much flavour and identity to the Pokemon. It pushed battles beyond just a matter of stat points. There's a lot more nuance to them now because of abilities being added in. Double battles were also introduced in Hoenn. This is something my brain definitely rejected at first. This was like blasphemy to 10-year-old me. You can't have two Pokemon battling at once, what the hell? Now it's the VGC standard, and I really hope it stays that way. I actually really enjoy it. Single Pokemon battling just would not have the same strategic edge. One thing I definitely didn't complain about in the beginning was the running shoes. Oh my god, the difference they make. I'm a huge bike propagandist in Pokemon games, but in Hoenn, I barely use it, because running feels so smooth. Maybe because of the 60 FPS. For some reason the Gen 3 games run at 60 FPS, but it does feel quite nice. Pokemon got one hell of a facelift in Ruby and Sapphire. Still a far cry from what the games are nowadays, but the point being that some of these quieter upgrades ended up being defining features for the series going forward. Looking back on Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire now, it is honestly kind of surreal just how much these games ended up shaping the series. Not the most dramatic of titles, and they definitely released at a time when Pokémon was at a bit of a crossroads, right as Pokemania was dying down. But I think just enough risks were taken with these games. Silly kids like me had a bit of a visceral reaction to a lot of them. Probably not too many of them had a complete meltdown and left the franchise for multiple generations like I did. That said, I think my interest in other things just overtook Pokemon for a while. 2003 to 2006 was my peak Yu-Gi-Oh phase, and I was getting really into sports at that time too. So yeah, probably just a mix of things pulled me away for a little while. It wasn't just being disappointed in these games. But I'm really glad I came back to these titles, and didn't just play the remakes and be done with it. There's definitely still a lot of value in these original Ruby and Sapphire games. I think they've aged really well. The world building and the tone, and the right amount of mechanics existing within here that it feels nostalgic without also feeling bare-boned. They're just a blast to play in my opinion. And whether you grew up with these games or discovered them later down the line, I think that feeling still sticks. So why don't you drop any thoughts and opinions you have about Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire down in the comments section. Please do leave a like while you're down there, that's a huge help. Join the Discord if you'd like to chat over there. Thanks so much for hanging out, appreciate you guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.